Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan, and today's episode is sponsored by Swings. They're like chairs with commitment issues. They never seem to want to settle down. Today I want to tell you the story about the Empire's first superweapon. You see, the super laser on the Death Star was by far the most difficult component to construct. At the core of the super laser technology was the Kyber crystal, and Kyber was always a material that was jealously guarded by the Jedi. From a religious point of view, they didn't really want anyone poking around with their magical crystals, figuring out how it works. Not only was it considered sacrilege, the Jedi also understood the potency hidden inside of these Kyber crystals, and they really didn't want to see other people weaponize it. Because they've done it before, and it was pretty terrifying. Like, take a look at this lightsaber rifle from the old Republic era. This thing was absolutely crazy and also poorly made. It used lightsabers as ammunition and essentially was a handheld super laser. Jocasta Nu actually banned Vader from the Jedi archives for breathing too loud with this thing. Of course, this was not an efficient or sustainable way to use Kyber, as it destroyed the lightsabers with the crystals inside of them, after like 4 shots. And so, in many ways in the Star Wars galaxy, in the scientific community, unlocking the secrets of the Kyber crystal is like, unlocking fusion reactor technology here on Earth. Which is confusing because fusion technology does exist in Star Wars. And so what I mean is, like, unlocking the full potential of the Kyber crystal is something that the scientific community, especially crystallographers, really focused on, but it was always seen as something that wouldn't really happen for another few decades. It was always a technology that was slightly out of reach. But that kind of mindset never really worked for Palpatine. From the moment he took over the Republic as the Supreme Chancellor, he already dreamed of creating a superweapon. Massive constructs that could serve as a physical manifestation of his political power and Empire's economic strength. But unfortunately, director Orson Krennic and his chief scientist Galen Erso were still cooking up their super laser project, and for now, Emperor Palpatine will need to rely on just some good old-fashioned firepower and size for his first superweapon. So yeah, today we'll be taking a look at the Galactic Empire's first superweapon, known as the Eye of Palpatine, and although it doesn't have a super laser, it features some really innovative and kind of unique designs you'll not see on other Star Wars ships. Should be mentioned, this ship was first introduced in the expanded universe novel Children of the Jedi, but most recently it was canonized in a Rebel intelligence report focused on Imperial superweapons written by Colonel Haxon Delto, the chief of Rebel intelligence, General Aaron at McCracken. In 18 BBY, after diverting considerable amounts of government funds into his own direct management, the Emperor secretly started the construction of the Eye of Palpatine. Imperial engineer Oran Kaldor was stationed in the secretive Maw installation and was tasked with designing the starship. The overall project was spearheaded by the Imperial Department of Military Research, which is basically in charge of all superweapon projects carried out by the Imperial military. Under Palpatine's direction, Kaldor's design looked like a massive asteroid more than it did a ship. The silhouette of the vessel is asymmetric, and the surface of the vessel was covered in impact craters. With plenty of shielding to conceal energy emissions and communication signals, the Eye of Palpatine could basically enter a system, on the peripherals of a system, undetected hopefully, and then power up its sublight engines for a brief period of thrust, and then sort of glide into the system undetected and sort of like an asteroid. Although some critics of Palpatine's regime have theorized that most likely Palpatine made this ship into an asteroid not just for stealth, but in order to conceal this project from the Imperial Senate, which was still intact and still capable of protesting his actions. A lot of Palpatine's decisions, especially early on during his reign, were still somewhat driven by his hatred and fear of the legislature. For instance, Scarif, where the main Imperial archives were placed, was purposely built as far from Coruscant as possible to discourage Imperial senators from stopping by for an inspection. The construction of the Eye of Palpatine was done in 2 specific locations, Rothana and Patrim shipyards over the planet of Hakaleg. We covered Patrim shipyards a bit in our last video on the Tarkin superweapon that was also built in that shipyard. Patrim was a system located in the Siswana sector in the Outer Rim, which was also Tarkin's home sector, so it kind of makes sense that the Tarkin was built there. But Rothana might be a world that many of you Clone Wars era fans might remember. Located on the edges of the Outer Rim in wild space, Rothana was purchased by Quat Drive Yards in around 800 BBY. Shortly after, Quat Drive Yards created a subsidiary company known as Rothana Heavy Engineering. This is where KDY would hide all of their most secretive projects and research, including the creation of the fleet that would support the clone army during the Battle of Geonosis. It was really the perfect place to hide projects that you didn't want pesky journalists or legislators to find. And so, yeah, it was a perfect place to construct the Eye of Palpatine. My guess is that the internal structure of the ship was constructed at Patrum shipyards, at which point this unfinished vessel that really doesn't represent an asteroid would be towed to Rothana, where it would get its finishing touches, all that exterior plating, and I don't know if it's like a rock-like surface on the outside, but whatever it is, it's like heavy materials. But all of that was probably finished on Rothana in a very secretive location. The battle moon was 19 kilometers in length, roughly the same length as many of the super star destroyers employed by the Imperial Navy, and roughly the length of like Manhattan Island. So that's pretty big. But because of the shape and the internal volume of this ship, this was actually much larger than your average super star destroyer and could hold many more systems on board. I believe Mara Jade commented about the construction of the ship, and she basically stated that during this period of time, to get the amount of firepower that Emperor Palpatine wanted, you had to build a city-sized ship to contain all of the internal components for the firepower, right? Like the Death Star actually is a lot more potent and theoretically could be placed in a much smaller kind of structure like the Tarkin superweapon we covered in our last video. Now, the Battle Moon's main firepower came from hundreds of turbo lasers that were all concealed in craters and other irregularities on the surface of the ship. Most of these turbo lasers could be aimed by a laser targeting emitter that was basically placed right next to the bridge of the ship. It said that the Eye of Palpatine had enough firepower to rival an entire Imperial fleet and could be used in base Delta Zero operations. That's basically the Imperial code for heavy orbital bombardment that essentially melts the crust of a planet, rendering an entire region or the entire planet uninhabitable. But the minerals are still going to be intact if you want those things. The bridge of the ship was located at the bow of the vessel, and there were several Merson Guardian-class deflector shields placed at strategic locations where the ship's metallic hull was exposed beneath the rock layer. See, the entire asteroid coating was not just great for camouflage, for covering heat signatures and energy signatures. It was also great for protection. The asteroid cover could shield the ship from everything from micrometeorites to sustain heavy fire from turbo lasers. You literally had to mine away the exterior of the ship with lasers before you could get to the sweet and scrumptious inside where all of the important components are. Also, this ship was covered in sublight engines, giving it thrust. Now, the Eye of Palpatine usually had a large contingent of Imperial stormtroopers on board, with several squadrons of TIE fighters, bombers, and GAT-12 skip ray gunboats, and a variety of different transports. But if you actually walked onto the bridge of this vessel or took a look inside of one of the turbo laser batteries, you'd find no people there, and that's a part of the design of this ship, to kind of limit how many people will actually know about this ship. Emperor Palpatine automated all of the crew positions on the vessel. See, the entire ship was powered and controlled by an extremely advanced AI known as the Will, and it really did control everything from the reactor to the engine room, navigation, and even individual gun emplacements. You see, Oren Kaldor, the designer of the ship, had been tutored by one of the leading AI specialists in the galaxy, Nazra Magrodi, Professor Nazra Magrodi. Rarely in Star Wars do we see droids or AI brains in control of such large and crucial systems, let alone entire ships. And of course, this would backfire in a spectacular way down the road. On its first mission, the Eye of Palpatine would be deployed by Palpatine to destroy a small Jedi settlement in the Outer Rim, located on the planet of Belsavis. Belsavis' surface was covered in a massive planet-wide glacier, but there were small cuts and sulfur-filled valleys dotting the planet, melted by geothermal activity. In one of these small areas, a sanctuary was built by the Jedi Master Plet, right on top of a geothermal vent. When the Great Jedi Purge happened, several Jedi younglings were hidden there. I don't know why the Emperor thought it was necessary to send such a massive superweapon to take out such a poorly defended settlement, but I guess you should never underestimate the Jedi. Now, from the very beginning, the Eye of Palpatine ran into a lot of problems on this mission. First, Palpatine really needed to hide this operation from the galaxy because, people would be outraged if they found out what he was up to. Not only was his weapon made secretly with taxpayer money and also kind of unnecessary, no one wants to see a bunch of kids get, messed up like this, trapped like fish in a barrel and getting turbo lasers fired on top of their heads. And so in order to hide the large troop movement that would be needed to man the ship's onboard contingent, Palpatine dispersed stormtroopers all across the Outer Rim, where they would wait to be picked up by the Eye of Palpatine. While the Eye of Palpatine did choose to travel on lightly traveled hyperspace lanes, they were eventually discovered and intercepted by a Jedi strike team made up of Geith Iris and Callista Ming, who together boarded the vessel in the Moonflower Nebula. This is kind of a tragic story. See, Geith and Callista were a couple, and when they went onto the ship, they realized that the AI Will was controlling everything, and it would be very difficult for them to destroy the ship, and they disagreed on how they would do things. Now, Geith wanted to go back and go look for help. Callista wanted to stay on board and figure out how she could sabotage this from within. The two end up separating, and Geith attempts to escape the Eye of Palpatine on a GAT-12 skip ray blast boat. The Jedi Knight was confident that he had figured out the pattern of the station's automated defenses, and, well, he didn't, and was blown to pieces. Callista stayed on the ship, devastated by the death of her lover. She realized that there was really nothing she could do to destroy this ship from inside. And so she makes a pretty crazy choice. She merges her own consciousness with the ship's AI, leaving her physical body behind. Once inside, she managed to disable the ship's navigation and weapon system, halting the ship's destructive path towards Belsavis. Palpatine was pissed off, of course. He imprisoned a bunch of people, threw some tantrums, but there was really nothing he could do outside of that. The Eye of Palpatine would be lost before it even completed its first mission, which is kind of typical of Imperial superweapons. For years, the Eye floated in deep space, dormant and lost, until it was found by the Emperor's Hand, Roganda, Ismarin in 12 ABY. The Emperor's Hand were very capable agents that were extremely loyal to the Emperor, and Roganda was very interested in revitalizing the Empire. Now, interestingly enough, when the Eye of Palpatine was reactivated, it continued its previous programming, which was to pick up all the Imperial Stormtroopers contingents that were waiting for the ship. Of course, because of the Empire's collapse, most Stormtroopers had either died or ditched their uniforms or given up. There just weren't, all of the original Stormtroopers that were waiting for the ship, they're gone. And so the Eye of Palpatine adjusts its parameters by picking up any sentient beings it could and then essentially brainwashing them into thinking that they were Imperial Stormtroopers, which is all sorts of bizarre. And this meant that there were all sorts of non-human species on board, like Tusken Raiders, Tripods, Gamorreans, Jawas, and Tals. It's a pretty crazy situation. In many ways, the Eye of Palpatine went from being a superweapon to a bizarre prison of sorts that again was focused on making Imperial Stormtroopers out of the most random species. Luckily, Castilla Ming was still active inside of the ship, but fighting against an AI for 30 years, it's difficult, it's tiring. But she does manage to guide a Jedi strike team led by Luke Skywalker, the cyborg Jedi Nikos Mar, and the brilliant Jedi scientist Cray Mingla into the core of the ship, where they plan to trigger a core overload that hopefully will create a chain reaction that finally destroys the Eye of Palpatine. While fighting through waves of indoctrinated Tusken Raiders and Gamorreans who thought again they were Stormtroopers, Cray Mingla decides to upload her own consciousness into the Eye of Palpatine. You see, she was mourning the physical death of her own partner. The cyborg Nikos Mar was originally a real human being, but he had succumbed to a degenerative neurological disease, and what was left was just like an empty shell. Cray Mingla had refused to let him go, and perhaps there's like a lesson there about Jedi attachment, but let's skip that. Now, while on the mission, she comes to a realization that she'll never get her old love back again, and that Nikos Mar was now just an emotionless shell of what he once was. I gotta say, in Legends, there's a lot of campy and horrible Jedi characters that just are, cringy, but at the same time, there are a lot of great characters, and more importantly, the Jedi in Legends are so much more relatable than the weirdos you see in the main films, right? They're actually human. They have relationships. They love, and they cry, and they make mistakes. They try to revitalize their fallen loved ones and turn them into, Frankenstein. Stuff like that. So basically, Cray Mingla had enough with life, and by uploading her consciousness into the Eye of Palpatine, she could finally give Castilla Ming some relief, and more importantly, allow her to transition into her body and come back to life. Unexpectedly, when this transfer happens, the AI Will basically goes berserk and loses control of the ship, and chaos ensues, allowing the Jedi strike team to destroy it with relative ease. The Eye of Palpatine explodes while in orbit over Belsavis, its original destination and target. Crisis averted. The Eye of Palpatine is definitely one of the most unique super weapons developed by the Empire, not only because of its weird design and shape, but because of the powerful AI that was used to control the ship. In Star Wars, droids and mechanical beings are rarely ever placed in such important roles, and perhaps this is why. So there you have it, guys. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy. I'll see you next time. Oh, it came back. I came back again. It's less cool. It's less cool. I gotta end facing this way. Alright, freeze.